this way, but hey, there it is, right? Morning, everybody. Welcome. 8 o'clock my time, 7 o'clock on the West Coast. I think most people are recovering from last night, which is just fine. Today, we're going to be talking about breaking the myths regarding landrace. And we'll see if we can't destroy 6 of those myths. Burn a little bit of sage here that my thoughts might come clear. And we keep it in a piece of abalone shell. Ome padme adme om. I have both screens going on the dual cast here from my personal channel as well. So again, good morning. Happy winter to you almost. We're going to be there soon. And let's see, I want to touch on folks might not know who I am. And I'm kind of a nobody, but I'm also somebody who's been around for a minute. I started playing with landrace in 1986. It was bag seed from Mexico, brickweed. That's kind of what everything we have today began with somebody else's bag seed from somewhere around the world. We have all these awesome modern strains today. And let's see. They all were bred over time, primarily in rudimentary, smaller environments by people who are extremely passionate about cannabis as a medicine and herb and stuff. Stuff comes from all around the world and intermixed to get what we have today, and we're still in the early inceptions of really breeding. We haven't got into real breeding yet. It's coming, right? But we're still in these rudimentary stages of what is cannabis. One of the things we're at right now with breeding, though, that I see is it's like, okay, so we're in breeding for straight THC, right? And I hear people talking about utilizing colors as a metaphor, talking about being an artist. I don't know if any of those people actually use paint as an art form, because when we take all these different colors and we keep mixing them together, we end up with something called mud. And mud is just like this ugly brown, gray, muddled everything you can't discern. There's nothing beautiful about it. It's just kind of like everything gets mixed together. Right. And so we're sort of there with polyhybrids, right? So let's see, what's the first myth? I'm going to hit 6 myths of cannabis. One of them being, you'll hear me talking all the time, praise on people saying, hey, y'all ought to be breeding landrace. And I'm specifically talking to people who are breeders who want to really understand and master the plant. If you're a small grower in your closet, or you have a 4 or 6 plant count, a lot of these things that we classify as landrace are not going to be to your best interest unless you really just like want to have a better understanding of the plant. Okay, and so there's a huge disparity there. If you really need some medicine and you're sick, searching those plants isn't going to be the thing for you to do. It's going to be more along the lines of, if you know somebody else who has searched them, that can find something. And or so another I mentioned in the introduction, as young initiates to the plant, and we learn about what a landrace is, it becomes this mystical thing to us in the far off lands and places that are hidden from us from corporate media here in the West, right? We don't know anything about the cultures that these plants come from. We don't know. We're told to be afraid of people from foreign lands and quote unquote third world countries and stuff. And time is changing. The world's getting smaller through internet and all that. So when the word landrace gets used, and here's 5 myths right here. There's very different things included in that word, and a lot of people will debate me on this, and some people who we should be able to have great conversations with will just, because I include wild plants as landrace, and in my classification I call those true landrace. They're the origins of the base genetics of everything. Okay, so then we can debate about, well, there's feral and there's wild, and if there's any wild and all that stuff. Let's just leave that aside and just understand that, yes, there are plants growing wild, whether they originated there or feral, right? And then we definitely have plants that are feral. We have mountainsides of feral. Then we have the stuff that is grown as a crop. Okay, so these are different things that people can classify as a landrace, and so in the mystical mindset of the initiate that has the wherewithal to travel the world, they think, I'm going to go find myself some base genetics and breed with them, or have them for smoke, and they might go find a wild plant someplace and bring it home and try and grow it, and it's not anything at all like what we would have in a dispensary or what you would share with your friend for so many reasons, right? It hasn't been bred for structure. It hasn't been bred for the chematography. It hasn't been bred for all these other things that we like as a nice high or this, that, or the other thing. But what that plant is good for, though, is whatever traits it does exhibit as a dominant could be reinserted into these polyhybrids that were lost. Okay, so those plants aren't necessarily going to be something that somebody grows normal for a home grower and things like that, unless you really want to understand the plant better and all its dynamics. The wild and the feral, those are definitely, you're not going out looking for that stuff as a home grower. We get into those plants that are domesticated and they're in the field, and these are still fairly rough plants, even here. And I'm going to break this in. I've come up with a new classification here at this point, and so we have these domesticated landrace, but we also now have these new domesticated landrace, the new field crops. Okay, so the original, through whatever warfare, eradication, and anthropomorphic translocative genetic pollution, right? There is multiple, the old original landrace may or may not be in place as a domesticated crop. And so the overall accepted term for landrace in the greater community would be these plants that are planted in the same fields by the same community, as selected as an heirloom, where they're just picking the best plant over time, right? And might be open pollinated, and then it might be interspersing with these plants in the wild. Okay, the feral and or wild plants, right? So that would be the original old landrace I like to refer to. But now I'm come up with this new term. It really just popped into my head in the last 24 hours maybe, and what it is the new landrace. And I sort of, this comes from when I was studying, doing field science, botany primarily, and studying the effects of wildfire on natives versus introduced species, right? And there was a term utilized, and they called them new endemics, and this were the plants that were brought in that dominate California's landscape now, when the Spaniards brought cattle over, right? And it was stuck in their hooves and it was stuck in their fur and whatnot, but completely changed the plant regimes of the West Coast. Translocative, so anthropomorphic translocative genetic pollution, right? And that's one that my mentor taught me. And if you break it down, it means people carrying seeds around and messing up the original landrace in other places. So let's see. Free stream in here. Let me catch myself again. The new landrace, right? Okay, so and so there's the wild, there's the feral, there's the field, there's the new field, right? And so, but then when we're like a small closet, you've got plant counts, you've got restrictions or whatever it is. We got this category that when I say you need to grow some landrace, this is where we're getting to. And then when I say you can find some really amazing landrace, this is the cultivar inbred lines of landrace. Okay. And so that would be things like where, if I got it right, Mel Frank bought a bag of weed from a Amsterdam coffee shop. Long time ago, it was labeled as Durban poison. It was field weed grown in a traditional area in South Africa, right? That was smuggled into Amsterdam. Okay, and there's still still smuggling. I just watched a video last night about 40 tons of hashish that was busted this past summer coming from Africa to Spain in multi-million-dollar sailboats. And they literally had, I'm going to put this on my personal channel linked. It had big ass freaking bales of 1 kilo hash packages. And flower of the countryside for y'all. That's a new term we can employ for Landrace. Is that's how they labeled in Arabic all these hash bales. And I got a little lesson today myself. Flower of the countryside. So, and that's probably stuff coming out of Morocco, right? North Africa. Terrible waste to see. So we have these we have a high access right now through internet and globalization getting smaller and everything with what we call the new landrace. And there's also people who are going around collecting feral and wild specimens for us to have access to. And so if you're going out and you say, hey, I want to check this landrace stuff out and see what the attributes are, you really need to be aware of these different categorizations or levels of domestication. And for the average Joe, you really want to find somebody who's refined that, like that Durban. So the story goes, Mel got, if I got this right, and I've just heard it from secondhand from somebody else, and didn't even go back to review to make sure I got the right names. So, but he took those seeds out of the bag. He refined them a little bit. He ran them, and he found, I don't even know how many generations he before he handed some off. Right, and somebody else got a hold of them. So these are all famous names from back in the day, and this is how all the shit we got today came around. Was these guys were going around finding bag seed. They weren't necessarily original. Some people were traveling to those places, but it was going to be the exact same thing. They're taking a field seed versus a bag seed, right? They're just collecting it directly. And these things were inbred by people who are passionate about it. And it's the same, no different from cabbage and broccoli and all these things that we now have, these diverse foodstuffs, all come from a wild mustard plant. Okay, you would not recognize wild mustard plant for a cabbage or a broccoli or a Brussels sprout. That would be. And then I don't like eating mustard greens at all. I love eating cabbage, right? So it's the same process here. So the hardest work you're going to have is taking a wild plant and trying to domesticate it, especially without crossbreeding into other varietals. Okay. There's definitely, I've mentioned before, what are the different things we might want to find in these more wild plants that we're going to stabilize? One of the biggest things that you're going to find is all of them are going to be hermaphroditic. All these wild plants have their survival strategies 100% in the feral plants, as well as the domesticated landrace. Okay. I'd even say the new land races are going to have this. Once you get something that's been refined and cultivated and inbred into a proper lineage that's still designated a land race, such as Durban poison, there should not be that intersex issue at that point. That stuff should get bred out. And when that happens, though, I've pointed out on all sorts of other breeding things, we are selecting against a particular thing. There's other stuff that's attached to that. And so we're going to lose some attributes of that wild plant, right? But those are the ones that if you're a small time operator, you have plant counts and things like that, you want to taste and see, or if you're just getting into breeding, you want to see if you can't find these more refined cultivars inbred of landrace, right? Now, rarely there's people like me who will actually do these inbred cultivars where we actually maintain a semi-open pollinated status of this, where we'll select a couple of 3 females and a couple of 3 or 4 males that have the attributes that we're looking for, or hopefully. The hardest thing about it all, without having access to the laboratory, is knowing where that intersex lays, right? And so standard, if you're just doing a 1-to-1 inbred selection and refining a genetic, it could be easily 5 generations to get from a feral or a field strain into a inbred cultivar. Okay. Um, um, I think you can take stuff that's more close to wild and cross it into polyhybrids that are refined, especially if you have something you want to reestablish, for instance, stem strength or a terpene profile. Okay. One of the things that occurs though, the high THC levels of our polyhybrids are basically a stack of recessives and double recessives that allow that to happen. Okay, so you're not going to come back with a super strong THC level when you do those initial crosses. There's going to be all sorts of bizarre things, and you really, if you're someone like me who does these crosses and you release something like that, you need to make sure people know that's what they're going to be pheno hunting, not necessarily just planting at different stages. So some of my stuff is going to be more refined and some of it's less refined if you're looking at my particular genetics, for instance. And I do my best to point out what stages of things are at. Anyone ever wants to know, please feel free to hit me up and ask, where are these at in the journey? It takes a lot of work. And today, just selling off flower or hash from the process of breeding, covering the cost of doing what it is to do all that work. And it's, people's like, oh, do what you love. And it's like, okay, so there's all that process. Okay. There's all of the process involved in it. Sometimes it literally is work to get to where you love. Okay. Checking against environment and stuff. Checking against. Well, I mean, one of the hardest parts of the job is testing the chemistry through smoke. And if you got a dozen is hard. 25 or 30 is really hard. And going through and gauging is like, is this the one I want to pursue and why? Right. That's. Sometimes, you get the wrong combination in testing and it's 6 hours later, you miss most of the day because you just woke up again. Right. People don't understand the trials and tribulations that can occur. So let's see. What kind of stuff would you get from a wild plant, for instance? And well, again, that's going to differ from around the world and where it originated, right? And where it was collected. And so something that's growing feral, for instance, in the walking corridor of the Hindu Kush versus something that's growing wild in Annapurna. Going to be extremely different plants, right? But these are different. These both have it, right? We've just got a 70-mile-an-hour wind ripped all the snow off my roof. That's cool. Testing in progress. Nice. Blowing smoke in Cali. Excellent. Yeah, sorry, I got distracted by the wind. I love energy. So that might be something that we're looking for. Is as time progresses, we see, like, what did I mention earlier? There was like 30-something tons of hash was seized by Spanish authorities, right, this summer. Okay, in sailboats. People in America are going to be like hit with this big, huge up and comings when we have international trade comes through. Right, we got all this back pile of flour and stuff, and grown in these multi-million-dollar facilities, and we're going to be competing with literally poor ass dirt farmers who live all around the globe, right? And international corporations with oil tankers full of this stuff. And it's kind of how it was back in the 70s and 80s before we really had Northern California cranking it. It was just getting dumped on us from around the world for super cheap, right? And for instance, the difference back in the day for brickweed out of Mexico versus the chronic out of the Triangle, early 90s, you're paying $600 a pound third hand over the border, and $600 got me 2 ounces, right? And that's the reality that's going to hit folks. So if you're not breeding with this landrace to be able to make it a lot fucking cheaper to grow right in your back, in your dirt farm, you're going to have some marketing scheme to keep rich people buying it. Okay, besides quality, right? Quality is always going to sell. So, for instance, what's one of these wild plants going to do for you? It's been dropping down into 20. I think we might have had one 16-degree night out here, and there's still 3 seedlings from my Hindu Kush reproduction project, and they're growing fine. Okay, I did, because I wanted to test them, not for my locality. I know it can drop down to 10 here for a month and they'll be done. But for other locations that hover at the edge of freezing, so I went ahead and threw them into my cold frame and propped up a bunch of bags of leaf around them to maintain and keep the soil from freezing hard, and see if I can't keep things on a location that may be a little lower in elevation, a little further south, but just touches on freezing in the winter. And these plants, these seedlings, are going to survive. They'll drop a taproot, and you can dry farm them. You won't have to pay for irrigation, for instance. Okay, so that's a huge one. These plants grow naturally without irrigation, right? There's a huge one, and that there's a myth destroyed, is that you have to water your plant. Here in Utah, where we're in extraordinary drought, I've let hemp plants grow from seed this way in less than 2 inches of rain all summer during the growing season, and harvested two fodder crops, cutting them off for animal feed, and then a full seed crop. Okay, and we didn't get rain until the seed was all set and everything. That is something that one of my proteges, Robin, just mentioned, that he had a Tajikistan that I produced, and dry farmed it, and it was pretty funky. They had essentially 2 inches of rain in California this past season. They had 10 inches all in like 10 days. So it's all overland flow, and you really don't have that much water. He said it had some problems growing, was really funky, but it ran long. That's a particular one that never really seems to go past cloudy when I grow it. This is one of those typical north latitude, high elevation, narrow leaf strains that we talk about, where there's diversity in sativa and indica and confusion. And those are whole other episodes I'm going to get to after I get done with this landrace stuff again. But he says, it is extreme drought all summer where he's at in California, but then the October rain came and the thing just blew up and started growing and produced flower so heavy that he was starting to think he needed to stabilize it, right? So some water does help. But you don't need to have 3 inches a week. That's just, especially if you're able to get the tap root down. So that's one of the major things that I believe in, that people should be backbreeding for, is tap roots. Everything's grown from clone, and in the, what do we have it in our little micro laboratory or breeding space, where our nursery, right? And people use the plastic bag and paper towel nursery for these perfect conditions, and we'll set the temperature and everything, right? So you can get that genetic potential out for the things that we're selecting for, which means we're selecting against. And so that totally germination rates and success and all those things are lost when we breed that way. And so as we move forward into a larger industry and freedom, you're going to want to have access to be able to field plant for hash. That's just straight up tops for smoking flowers and bottoms for hash, or even just refining that higher dollar hash production into our more stringent controlled environments that we utilize. Working with Reeferman's, Aaron Jensen in chat, working with Reeferman's Cambodian Haze and A-Seed's Lebanese Sativa. Have to grow indoors, and the Lebanese is semi-auto. Yeah, no, this high, some of those are definitely, no, it's interesting. And so this is the reality of it. Breeding isn't taking perfect pedigrees and crossing them. It is, but it isn't. That's just eventually you end up in mud with the palette of color. Okay. And so taking these exploring these various directions and finding something that not only works for you, other patients, it's not just this muddled high THC thing. I mean, none of this stuff is going to probably be above 24%. There's definitely hash plants that are hitting 24% that come from field stock, right? Especially if you grow it in our specialized systems and everything. That's another huge difference is how you grow these. Some of them do not do well with intensive feeding programs. Some of them really prefer and need to have something like Layton's system with the horizontal, right? That's perfect for testing landrace, right? The whole system, it's going to go into a more difficult rooting structure for it to access. It's going to have bizarre watering layers and stuff. I know some people think that's a great system. I think it's great for utilizing rudimentary genetics that don't need to that are used to working harder. And that's my personal experience and understanding of that system and these plants, right? So, but yeah, a lot of times these raw genetic coming out of a field as a refined landrace from cultivar, or the new cultivars even still might not do so well with a intensive feeding program, and it'll cause them to hermy or even not flower well. So looking at their natural, once they've been refined and into cultivars, that's a whole nother story, because that refining process is all done utilizing these modern systems of feeding and such, right? For the most part, right? If you're going to do more than a few plants, it's really, 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 really hard to be working without a massive capital venture behind you to do hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of stems and soil, right? Moving the pots around alone, mixing the soil alone, it all takes huge amounts of process, which we can refer to as work that we love. So a wild plant, you get seeds from around the world from somebody who goes out and collects wild plants. We found this to be the case, and hopefully people hear that we need to actually grow those seeds as close to where they're collected, wild or feral, into a reproduction in a more modern system. I've been sent seeds from wild plants around the world, and just they do not germinate for whatever reason, whether it's the pH, whether it's, there's so many things that could go into the possibility, but they've got the solid hard rocks to them and everything. So the World War II hemp in Cal, Oklahoma, I understand was derived from Chinese hemp, when we had actual scientists working for the government breeding some hemp. And so that's the majority. They had already kind of eradicated hemp, and then they brought in seed stocks for the war. And that seems to be what where that originates. So here's one myth I'm going to destroy. People say, and I believed it for the longest time until I found this one, but there are no North American landrace, right? And across the board, that seems to be quite true. But there was some property owned since the King of Spain granted it to this particular family in eastern New Mexico, Rocky Mountain Panhandle, right? And so I've come into the seed. I'm not sure if there's anyone else has this out there, but I call it New Mexico Land Grant, Old Spanish Land Grant, and Garcia Fernando. Okay, so the best we can tell, Garcia Fernando is the man who owned the property in New Mexico, granted to his ancestors from the King of Spain in 1700. And so in 1971, 72, when Nixon put forth the edict that all cannabis in the United States should be eradicated, he said, this stuff has been here. It's part of the land. It's part of my heritage. And so his grandson is who I accessed a pack of he collected off the side of the mountain. And his words were, it smokes good. It grows all over the mountain, rocky mountainside, just pops out of the ground. And on wet years, it's everywhere. And on dry years, it just grows out of the arroyos and rills and gullies. And smells like a fucking skunk. It's a very racy, uplifting morning type of thing for me when I smoke it. And extremely hermaphroditic. It's not blowing balls everywhere, but in that early stage of flowering. And so I'm refining and working those out. And right now I'm at the third stage of refinement on those, and I've released some feminized seed for that for people. Oddly, people have been screaming for it for a while, and nobody's jumped on it yet. But yes, this is what I believe to be a true North American landrace that is not a hemp derivative. I believe it to be, or should we say, before the legal definitions of hemp applied to the chemistry of the hemp plant. So some of this I think is common knowledge, but may not be understood well by younger folks. That before Prohibition, hemp could have had any, it was more defined by the fiber production or the seed production than the chemistry. We can look at the old formulations from 130 years ago, late 1800s, in American stock, and they'll use these different names of trying to picture one of these labels. But there's Indian hemp, there's sativa, there's indica on these different labels, right? And so I think they were tapping into the CBD. We can also look at Shanagassi's original writings from when he was in India and first trying to figure out formulations for treating. I think there was a newborn baby that was having seizures, seizures it was. And so he concocted a alcohol extraction of one plant, and it worked great for a while. And then he went to another plant because the first one stopped working in tolerances, right? That was one of the first observances of tolerance and utilizing different genetics. But I seem to think off the top of my head, he was moving between what we call an indica and a hemp plant on those two. I'd have to review that, and that's definitely one of the shows I'd like to be putting forth here. But that's a whole nother thing that we can be adding into, right? Like these super high THC strains tend to be rather devoid of terpene profiles at times, and or other constituents and whatnot. So we can be back crossing in for terpene profiles, minor cannabinoids and things like that. So that initial F1 cross of whatever polyhybrid or inbred polyhybrid you've got versus these wild plant strains. So the wildest, there's this interesting curve that occurs with genetic diversity, right? A wild population is going to be quite diverse, right? And the feral population is going to be quite diverse. And then you have a little less diversity in the field. And then you have less diversity once we cultivate these field plants into a cultivar. Then you start producing polyhybrids and your diversity explodes again. You refine it back into an IBL, inbred line, and that diversity refines. And so, we're talking somewhat more like a true F1 when we're taking an IBL polyhybrid and crossing it to a field stock, right? And so you're going to have if you're selecting these more refined plants, you're going to have less in your Mendel square. You're going to have less possibilities to choose from, right? And we can only work with what we can. But my process, basically, I make that F1 cross, and then I try and back cross in both directions. It doesn't hurt when you're doing this stuff if you are able to initially cross in both directions. A lot of times it's not always possible because we're working with a cut, a clone only, and things like that. And so you if you're possible to keep observing your back crossing and squaring and looking at where things happen. Another one I do to do this properly is it's not just one male and one female. You want to take as many as you can possibly handle. And as we get into commercial breeding projects, it's literally going to be, you're going to be taking 20, 30 males and putting them into that many females, right? Or into a clone. And then you're taking 10 to 20 of each of those and looking at the results of those. And it's not really something we can actually do in a closet. It's not something I struggle with. If I just did with single project at a time, I could probably do the numbers in the 3,000 stems of a single project, right? And keep it all teeny small. And I'm working on the parameters that I'm able to work in. It's, yeah. But this is all stuff that needs to happen. And I pointed out in previous discussion, we look at the fellow who's breeding poinsettia is doing the exact same thing that most cannabis breeders do, where they go and they find somebody else's work, right? They find what appeals to them, and they take that and they do a sexual cross of those and create a new sexual progeny that is a novel new genetic mix, right? And he says clearly, we have a problem. We've got basically 2 or 3 original plants that we've bred all these from. And this is something else. If you look at the original plants they started with, that were they were somewhat cultivated by the Aztecs, right? And so we called them a landrace, and they had been refined to a point. But now we go to the store, and the point was like they had to manipulate the plant to produce, or put several in a single pot to get that. And this was like 100 years ago, or whatever it was, to get that to look like a bundle of flowers, right? And now we have these ones that literally, you put one flower in the pot and it explodes out into this massive color. Okay, so we can do these parallels with the cannabis so well, because it's the same kind of thing. A wild or a field plant is going to be a bit scragglier than this refined flower we're looking for smoking. Something to touch on, though, is those scraggly field plants are actually what you want for producing hashish. Okay, those trichomes are going to be accessible when you shake them. And a dense, hard nugget that we PGR and have bag appeal for is not necessarily the best thing, because you have to crush that entire rock up to get to the trichomes on the inside, if they even were able to develop fully. So the poinsettia guy, he totally inbred. He's observed that we've completely inbred these basically 3 genetics into each other multiple times, but all of that potential was there, right? All the potential for that ability to produce that big, massive bloom was always in the original landrace that they selected from. It just took the amount of selection and lining up those genetics to produce these double recessive expression. So the same kind of stuff goes on with the cannabis. And so and we listened to that Pozzetta story. He says, well, we've run into this massive problem inbreeding. We've lost all resistance to whitefly in our commercial production facility models. And he went back into Mexico, where somebody has under lock and key all the old Aztec varietals, and they have whitefly resistance. Okay, so that's the same thing. One of the major reasons I preach about landrace is disease resistance. Lost medicinal profiles. I've touched on. One of the other pro guys says he traveled the world, found a wild plant, took it home and grew it, and it was racy as fuck. It was too much for him. He had to give him anxiety, right? Well, that's definitely not necessarily something that the average recreational consumer wants, but it's definitely something that is a lost medicine for somebody who needs a metabolism stimulant. Okay. And so all these things that we're looking for recreation are going to outbreed and exclude the things we're looking for the actual medicines, the lost medicines. So when I'm working with some of these, I will necessarily take the scraggliest looking, least commercially viable plants, and I'll breed them to see what comes out of it. I'll cross it to something else to see what comes out of it. Okay, and that's where, if you see purple mutant chitral in some of my genetic, right? That was the narrowest, scrawniest looking, scraggly, barely even had any fluorescence at all, and I had to use tweezers to get any pollen out of it. Okay, it wasn't gonna pollinate anything without me really tweaking it. That's not something any commercial operator is going to ever look at. But what resulted when I crossed it to something was the largest cola I had ever gotten in a 3-gallon pot. Okay. And so not just the hybrid vigor, but there was stuff from that cultivar having been inbred it kind of started repressing itself on its expression capacity, and the recessives and stuff were able to just explode once they got that hybrid position, right? So these are some of the things. I'm going to recap. We have wild landrace, right? Or wild plants that I categorize as landrace, and other people will not. Okay, so there's no need for contention on that. It's utilizing words to communicate is all we need to do. Okay, and agree to disagree. So we have wild or native plants. We have feral. There are plants that were planted and went back in, and these things all can integrate the feral to the wild, right? And so that's where people will say, well, there's no such thing as wild anymore because pollen has blown about or been translocated by humans. Okay, so then we have the field cultivars that is the traditional term usage of landrace. It's mostly applied when people utilize it. Okay, so but the word landrace can be used deleteriously or out of context or confusedly to mean all these stages, right? And so unless you clarify what somebody means in conversation, you're going to be going boom, 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 boom. No, it's not. You don't want to grow that. You don't want to grow it, right? And it's like, no, you actually do want to grow landrace. It's which one of these stages do you want to grow, and are you capacitated towards? All right, so we've got our field, and the field can be mixing with the wild, and it can be mixing with the feral, depending on proximity and wind and weather patterns, right? And then we have our new cultivars, our new landrace. I've just come up with this term, and that's the stuff that's definitely been interbred. People sending seeds to them, and it's mixing around, and they've got some hybridized stuff. You know, so like Jamaica, the folks, Arjun will tell us that Jamaica being such a small area, the pollen from the new polyhybrids came in and overtook all of the dominant land races in that small area. And so now we have these new land races, okay? And the originals might still exist in somebody's collection, okay? And somebody who does preservation. All right, so the best and first thing you should do if you get a hold of some wild seed and you have the capacity to do anything with them is a preservation run. And that literally means you're just taking everything and growing it and open pollinating it and allowing it to grow. Then you have this massive seed stock of all of that genetic information, and it's been expanded. And so you can see at different corners of what's available when you open those up or you send them out to other people to do things with. But just killing the plant because it didn't meet the expectations of your mysticism, to me is a sin. But again, that's my mysticism. Okay, I'm a creation protectionist. I'm not a fundamental creation type, but I believe that whether it took 3 billion years or 6 days to create all this, it's way bigger than us to be greedy and destroy out of our own laziness and desires and such. So yeah, again with the feral, the same thing. And again with when you get into the ones that were in a field, right? And we have access to those. I think you can do a combination there where, because we're still going to have intersex issues and undesirable. We're just still going to have some scraggly plants and whatnot. But you're getting a lot closer to that refined plant that we want. And depending on whether we're going to use that for a hash plant or if you want to refine it into a flower plant, you're still probably going to want to do a open pollination expansion. At the same time, you can select cultivars for inbreeding, right? And then moving forward into that inbred cultivar that you can then utilize for F1 polyhybridizing and or present as a inbred specific landrace cultivar that people can utilize for breeding or for its particular aspects, right? Maybe aim your self-love away from eyes in the future. That must be thing too else in there. So yeah, when again, the home grower, you're looking for those refined cultivars. You're not looking for the wild stuff, not necessarily looking for the field stuff. People who have an operation and want to have something unique, that field stuff might be the place to start. right? Because the cultivars, the inbred cultivars, have been around quite some time already and have been utilized. Landrace strains are thriving in the So, and again, there's some places where there are still unadulterated genetics, but without having access to them, we can only conjecture, right? And so it's been 20 years. My mentor's passed on, but he was traveling in the 70s and 80s, walking the hippie trail, and just like Origin, nobody knew back then what the pollution of genetics was going to do. And that's why a lot of folks from back then became landrace preservation enthusiasts, because they realized, oh, I fucked up. I traveled the world with my polyhybrids from the States, and I traded those to the locals for the best of their local stuff, and I polluted their local stuff. So yeah, there may and may not be those populations in situ still. Yep, there's a lot of the Pakistani landrace. So Indian landrace strain, Deepak is already an IG. It was an amazing resource for a lot of this eastern. So he's primarily northern India and Pakistan and eastern Afghanistan. I understand is where his connections tend to be. But there's other people. Angus, he's got a bunch of great work as well, right? These sweet things that come out. Yeah. No, Winnie P, that's exactly what I'm talking about. The new landrace. It happens. Yeah, so there's a whole new mindset. So there's people riding the hide horses that want to call me out and say I don't know what I'm talking about, don't know who I am, don't know anything about I've been doing this since the mid 80s, just kind of on my own on the side, and I ain't after a commercial sticker, etc. There's a lot of people who say don't do this, you don't want to do landrace, you don't want to, and it's like, no, they don't want to do that. Open your mind and see where your future lies and what the possibilities are. So there's plenty of room to create new varietals, new all sorts of stuff, and even like someone says, the root skunk's getting a ruderalis, not my root skunk. Then that root skunk was somebody else's actual hybridization of ruderalis landrace to skunk, and then I just took it to the next level and created a feminized from it. Okay, these are all different things that actual breeders do, and part of it's exploring. And it's like, if all I did was take other people's stuff and cross it or reproduce it, to me that's unethical, right? Doing it on a side project because I'm preserving it or I want to see what it does, or feminizing things that weren't feminized by the original breeder. These are all different ways where you're not really stepping to somebody's toes. There's definitely people get a hold of my genetics and they're making crosses that I've already made, and I don't mind that so much as long as you're not trying to sell them, right? I'm totally open for people taking all my work and utilizing it in their work, as long as you give credit where credit's due, and I try to do the very same best, right? So yeah. Now Dennis is talking about the anthropomorphic genetic pollution, and yes, today's industry is THC driven, but realize it's like if the alcohol business was just primarily specifically focused on producing straight alcohol, right? And you're just drinking Everclear all the time, and no, alcohol and THC are very different. Yes, this is true, but it's like, I like drinking wine sometimes. I like drinking beer sometimes, and I actually used to make a beer. I used to brew 2 to 3 batches a week for years and years and years. I used to drink huge amounts of alcohol. I never liked being drunk. I really enjoy the flavors, right? At some point, you get a little numb. I can't feel my toes. That ain't cool, right? And it's kind of the same thing with cannabis, but like. There was, for several years, I brewed something I called a breakfast beer. and it was basically a Belgian white with about 2% alcohol in it. And this was before I moved to Utah, but I literally poured that shit on my cornflakes and ate it for breakfast. Okay, it's just there's different people like doing different things, and so I kind of, if it wasn't for having charred my lungs firefighting, I burned over and without a shelter, 80-foot flames for 10 minutes one time. There's several others where, my ears were melting off the side of my face and shit. But you breathe a lot of fucking smoke. And so I prefer to just take a little bong hit, and that's all you need. Right. But I also really, really enjoy the flavors of cannabis and smoking. And so that without dealing with the coughing and such. So we have dabbing and we have those flavors. So sometimes I've got a plant that I call hippie crack because I just want to keep smoking. The flavor is so divine, and it rolls off your tongue as you exhale it, right? And luckily, it's not a super high potency plant. It has a bit of an uptick in its chemistry, and so I can take 5 or 6 bong hits of that and not just pass out. But the majority of my shit anymore, my pain's been fixed. I can't take 5 bong hits at 24%. Put it in a joint, and you waste most of it. Packing it in a bowl and puffing it slowly is all these produce a different response too, right? If you don't know that, similar to drinking wine versus beer versus alcohol, those also have slightly different chemistries to them besides the intense volume of alcohol per each brew. All right, so we're coming into the close here. I'm going to go ahead and wind her up. Why do we want to breed? We want to bring back with Landrace. We want to bring back various different attributes that may have been lost through inbreeding and selecting for a particular attribute, which is THC exclusively. Okay, SIM strength, disease resistance, bug resistance, flavonoids, lost medicinal structure of chemistry. All are things that we want to be looking at as a community on a global scale, not necessarily the people who are after dispensary sales of flower and dabs, right? They're on their journey doing their thing, and that's good for them. It would be better for them to not say that they dominate the world's culture and industry, and understand that there's like the rest of us who do what we do and places where we do it, which is the most of the world, right? Granted, yes, there's the most money, cash flow that comes out of California and the cannabis industry. And that has a lot to do with the fact that there's a shit ton of money in California to start with. People can afford to buy $90 grams of hash, right? But the majority of the world can't. And it's the same thing I talk about with artwork. Is the super refined art is like, the dollar wise, it's the greatest amount of artwork sold in the world, but volume wise, it's a freaking drop in the bucket for what's produced every year. It's the same thing with cannabis, right? So we've got wild cannabis, which can be referred to as a landrace. Some people don't, some people do. And you're in a conversation about landrace, you need to refer to or go back and ask for a definition as to what it is that you're communicating about, because a wild landrace is very different than an inbred cultivar of landrace. And there's a lot of structure in between there and levels of refinement and whether it is something you want to grow or not. Again, everything that we have today was derived from these lineages, whether they were polyhybridized or hybridized originally before they were refined into cultivars or not, right? So all of this is these spectrums of flow of this refinement. And this is all we're looking for. Primarily, we're looking for various recessives. And so when you just go and get one of these wild seeds or whatnot, these recessives might not even be showing up, and you have this amazing magical package that you didn't even recognize because you didn't open pollinate it to start with and expand the genome to look at the entire thing. So the wild, feral, field, new field, and the cultivars of landrace. These are, again, the different aspects that you might be discussing when you're talking about a various one. When you go to buy, you want to find out from the breeder which level that is, if it's going to meet and match your goals, desires, and needs. And then the great reward is getting to puff some of this stuff, right? You can't, I know. I see people showing. It doesn't, you can't, can you see? Here's some Breath of Red Dragon. This is my F2 selection, but it's highly crystallized. There's keef in the bottom of the bag. This is my Dr. Dream All Cure, which is 26 land races mashed up together. And then I'm back crossing them for my Dragon series, right? So you have access to the Dragon series, and they're literally in between my mentor, my brother, and I. We have 60 years cumulative, 3 scientists working on the Dr. Dream All Cure to bring it into the current state of cut only that it's at. And yes, my fingers are. This stuff's kind of dry. I left the bag open. I've been testing these. This is refined out though. I had 24 different selections out of the 70 from this run, right? I'm down to 5 in the F2. It takes work. That's what the process requires. And blessings on y'all. And yeah, the thing looks dirty. I use it a lot. I've had it for a long fucking time. I clean it once in a while, but there's not enough time in the day to keep it clean and smoked and do everything else. So I'm adapted. That's all I need for about 3 hours. Oh. Peace out, everybody. Gene editing's going to happen. Can't stop it. Shout out to Strong Style Organics, Louis Salazar. His nice. Shout out Robert Bandula Jr. Strong Style again. Foe by Foe, Winnie P. Shout out Dennis Cortez. Robert Mr. Greenfingers Thomas. And appreciate everybody in the North joining us today and learning a little bit about land races. I'm going to continue this series. We'll see y'all probably Wednesday morning. It's time for me to sign off. Peace out. I'm going to close out with, got a couple of minutes. Let's see here if we can do that. We can see what I'm doing. Templanus, I missed your question there. I'm sorry. I'll get on. We'll talk about some chitrol and some various regions in my land race talks coming up in the future here. I have no idea if this comes over on the radio or on the speakers or not. Beat off. Rhythm of the earth. Excellent. 9 o'clock. See y'all later. Boom.